How one woman enacts revenge upon dirty dealing would-be fraudster. Please do let me know if this is pretty revenge. But I do think it's pretty pro-revenge material. So back in the day my aunt lived in a council house in a rough area of London. She was caring for her young child, and my uncle was working. They tired of the city life, and this area had a lot of violence, drugs and the like. She wanted better for her child and family, so she decided to put in for a house swap to Devon. Which when you live in a council property you can do. My family had just moved there, talked about how nice it was and the like, and so she filed to swap. Soon she had found a nice little 2-bedroom flat and was scheduled to swap with a guy, details unknown. Everything went through fine and they moved to Devon and began a much calmer, safer life. My aunt is a very meticulous person, and so as soon as she knew she was moving she arranged for all of the post to be sent to the new address on the appropriate date. However, there were about 3 days in between where some post was still sent to her old address, and unfortunately this included 2 bank statements. One for my aunt and one for my uncle. Now any decent person would just throw them out, or forward them, send them back to the post office etc. But not this guy. He proceeded to open that mail, an illegal offense. Take the info to the Department of Records and locate my aunt's mother's maiden name. He then proceeded to attempt to open many credit cards in her and my uncle's name. Fortunately for her she was notified of this suspicious activity and managed to prevent this fraud from happening, which would have ruined both of their credit and destroy their chances of getting a mortgage, which they eventually did. My aunt reported this to the police. However, as no crime of fraud had actually been committed, stopped by the banks and my aunt, there were no grounds for criminal charges. Now see, this boss had not been as meticulous as my aunt in redirecting his mail. And so the letters began to pile up. My aunt decided tit for tat, and opened some of the letters. Turns out this guy was in some pretty serious debt and had been avoiding the debtors. Moving being a pretty big way of getting away from them. This guy, before committing his attempted fraud, had asked my aunt to not give out his new address. So much aunt did what anyone would do, and called up the debtors one by one, told them that the guy no longer lived at the address. They were obviously disappointed, until she gave them the new address, to which they were delighted. Now they knew where he was, and began to hound him for the debt he owed, so much so that he lost that lovely council property, which if he had stayed in, purchased and then sold on would be worth quite a bit of money, since the area has now undergone a lot of investment and growth because he had to skip town to get away from his debtors. If he had been an upstanding citizen and not a ithead, he probably would have gotten away with it and lived a relatively carefree life. Edit, tasty medals. Thank you kindly mysterious person. You say you're not hitting snooze all morning and ruining my sleep? I had a good friend staying on my couch years ago. I slept in the loft, so every morning I could hear his alarm go off, much earlier than I would normally wake up. I didn't mind, because he needed to get up early for work. But, annoyingly, every day he would, without exaggeration, hit snooze 8 or more times. So I would be woken up again and again for an hour or more while he tried to get his it together. It would take him at least 45 seconds each time the alarm went off to notice and hit snooze. I would notice the instant it went off, and lie there awake waiting for him to come to and turn it off. Knowing though that it would go on endlessly. It was ruining my morning sleep. When I confronted him about it, he denied hitting snooze more than once, if at all. He was sleeping so deeply he honestly didn't remember doing it, and refused to believe what I was telling him, or acknowledge how much it was bothering me. I suggested that he just set his alarm for the time he needed to wake up and let us both enjoy sleeping rather than suffering through continual alarms. He doubled down on his story that he was basically getting right up with the first alarm. I was counting though, and some days it was 12 times he was hitting snooze. After a couple weeks of this, while he was at work, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I took his alarm clock apart, found the wiring on the circuit board that connected to the snooze button. I had originally planned to just disable the snooze button so he would be forced to get up on the first alarm. But with the clock apart, I came up with a better plan. I wired the snooze button to the alarm off switch, so now instead of resetting the alarm to go off again in 10 minutes, it would just shut it off entirely, if he was getting up on the first alarm like he said. It shouldn't be a problem, right? The next morning I heard my friend's alarm go off, and him eventually roll over, grunt, and hit snooze, as normal, but then I got to enjoy a few more hours of sleep until he finally woke up on his own and ran out the door cursing loudly. Late for work. This went on for about a week, him snoozing his alarm once, sleeping in, and being late for work. He sheepishly confided in me that his alarm wasn't working for some reason, and that he was afraid of losing his job. He said it worked fine when he tested it, but never worked in the morning. He didn't know what to do, but he didn't trust his alarm anymore. That was supposed to be my moment of glory, but I honestly felt too bad for him at the time to rub his nose in his lack of awareness of his own obnoxious alarm habits. He had just gone through a bit of a hard time, and been a good friend to me through my own difficulties. I told him he should probably just get a new clock, and shortly thereafter we both moved to a new city. I forgot about it until years later when we were reminiscing, and I told him how I had sabotaged his clock and how it proved that he was a chronic multi-snoozer. I'm still super proud of how it worked out, even if I was the only one who could appreciate it at the time. Not a good idea to hire your girlfriend instead of the shop teacher. This story is about my dad and happened in the mid to late 70s. My dad taught shop in a very tough part of town. Think ghetto area with beginnings of gangs. He was highly respected by all of his students because they knew he wouldn't tolerate their BS. Summers were a tough time for our family because teachers do not get paid for summers. So they have to find jobs. One year there was a perfect job at the school that was tailor-made for my dad. The group funding the summer class actually wrote the job description with my dad in mind. The school principal chose to hire his mistress to teach this vocational class instead. The woman had absolutely no clue about the subject matter. She was an English teacher, but she got the job instead. My dad was quite angry, and so was the group funding the job, but hiring was solely the principal's decision. The principal was married to a woman with money and he did not want her to know about his mistress. My dad helped the janitor with a lot of maintenance for the school and was good friends with him. My dad had keys to the entire school because of this. He also had a lot of experience with all sorts of locks, a hobby of his. Dad knew that making friends with the janitor and secretary would help him around the school, and he made a point of doing this at every school. He knew where the combination to open the giant safe in the office was. For some reason the school had been built with a huge old-fashioned safe, think bank safe type, and the principal kept the combination written down inside a desk drawer. Yes, that was an idiot move. But this man was very arrogant and refused to ever change the combination or memorize it. Who would dare to get into his things? My dad never threw things out and often pulled things out of the dumpster if he thought they might be useful. One of the things he rescued from the dumpster was a life-size skeleton that was discarded when a biology teacher left suddenly. The principal was freaked out by it and ordered it tossed because the teacher left. The skeleton was not school property and the principal had no idea that my father had rescued it from the dumpster. The principal gave his mistress very expensive status symbol type things. This included a mink coat, jewelry and expensive trips. Both principal and mistress told their spouses that the trips were to educational conferences. Being friends with the secretary meant he heard all the gossip, and knew that the principal kept these items in the big safe in the office so that his wife would not know about them, and neither would the mistress's husband. Being really irate about the job because he had to find something else and because the kids would learn nothing from this job training course. My dad decided to set up revenge. He took the skeleton to the safe and dressed it in the mink coat and fancy jewelry. He put the skeleton on a stand that held it upright inside this big safe. Then he left for the summer. On the last day of the summer course, the principal and his mistress were getting ready to take a week-long trip together. They told their spouses it was for a conference. Then they went to get the coat and jewelry so the mistress would have a chance to wear them. The mistress didn't care that it was summer, she wanted to wear the coat. Yes, this makes no sense, but she was super status conscious and wanted to show it off. She was that kind of person. When the principal opened the safe, he saw the skeleton in the coat and jewelry. He had a panic attack. He had no history of heart trouble that he and mistress thought was a heart attack. They called an ambulance. Mistress went to the hospital wearing the jewelry that she grabbed while waiting for the ambulance. The coat was left on the skeleton in the safe. Wife showed up at the hospital and met the mistress in her jewelry. It was very distinctive and a style the wife had asked her hubby for on several occasions. The wife knew a teacher could never afford it. When principal and mistress left in the ambulance, no one thought to lock the safe. The door was just pushed shut, but it had a big wheel that had to be turned to lock it. Wife went to the school to see what was in her husband's office about the mistress, and she saw her dream coat in the safe. The wife never saw the skeleton because the janitor took it out of the safe after the ambulance left. Principal knew he was in a lot of trouble with his wife and the school board. He kept ranting about a skeleton, but it wasn't there and he was the only one who saw it other than mistress. The school board thought he was delusional and had violated a morality clause in his employment contract. He got divorced and couldn't take any money from his wife because she proved his adultery. The mistress wouldn't talk to him or say anything about the situation because she didn't want to incriminate herself. After the principal was fired, his secretary testified about his mistress and the money spent on her at the divorce proceedings. He literally lost everything including his pension. His wife got it all. The mistress tried to lie to her husband about why she was there and said the jewelry was from a contest for best teacher. Her husband divorced her and got custody of their kids, not common in divorce at that time, because of her infidelity being a bad influence on the kids. She got fired and had to give the jewelry to the principal's wife. The school board did an audit of the school budget. The principal got arrested for fraud and embezzling because he used school money for the coat and for trips that he and mistress took that were supposedly for educational training. My dad thought this was all exactly what the principal and his mistress deserved. He would not have said anything about this matter if they didn't take a really good paying summer job away and they didn't leave a bunch of kids stuck in a class where they would learn nothing because all the teacher could do was tell them to read the book. She couldn't do any of the projects that were part of the course because she was an English teacher and not a shop teacher. To be honest, I think depriving the kids of solid job skills that the class was designed to teach upset him even more than having to find a different summer job. He did enjoy having a different principal the next year. Bully creates his own revenge. This one's a bit long, but please stick with me because it's a good one. So here's the basics. When I was a kid, my dad was in the service, U.S. Navy, and so we moved around a lot. Because of this, I was always the new kid over and over again. Meaning I was constantly the target of would-be bullies, and this made me fairly introverted and distrusting of other people by nature. In the waning years of my father's military career, he decided he would take his family back to his hometown and do some recruiting until he retired. So away we went to the family farm built by my great-grandfather. If anyone has ever found themselves moving to a small town suddenly, then you are well aware of what I mean when I say that the locals were very small-town minded. For those of you who don't know, the small-town mentality is basically thus: if you're not from there, born and raised, then you don't belong there. A lot of small-town citizens are closed off and want nothing to do with outsiders. So there I was, not only the new kid but introverted and an outsider, bully magnet. For the most part, one tried not to let it get to me, but I did have some bad days and got into a few fights. Always in self-defense though. And eventually, as people grew up, most of the other kids matured out of trying to be a bully and began to just leave me alone. Especially once they found out who my great-grandfather was, something about one of the 4 founding families, I don't know, I never really cared that much, and besides, those people had shown their true colors by treating me like crap for years by that point, but that's a different story. This story is about a kid we'll call Mike. You see, Mike was the only one who never seemed to grow out of trying to be a bully. He would daily track me down and tell me how worthless I was. That I was just some dumb farm boy who would never amount to anything and would always be a loser. He would walk up to me randomly and say things like, "I know you're going to be the one who shoots up the school someday. And when it ends with your suicide, I'll be the one cheering." He had some issues. At one point I arrived to school to find he had painted the combination on my locker with toothpaste. A lot of weird stuff like that. Anyways, we get into our senior year of high school and I've long since been doing my best to ignore him. His not being able to get a reaction out of me seemed to really upset him, and even his friends started saying his seeming need to find me every day to simply be a jerk was bordering on the creepy and obsessive. And then all of a sudden the verbal abuse stopped one day a couple months from graduation. I assumed he had finally just given up, but that wasn't the case. A couple weeks later I walked to the end of our long driveway to catch the bus and found that our mailbox had been run over. I didn't think anything of it at the time other than that it must have been some drunk. I get home later that afternoon, take some photos of the damage just in case, and then fix the mailbox. New wooden post buried onto the ground. I finish my other chores and homework and relax the rest of the evening. Next morning I go to catch the school bus and the mailbox has again been run over. I get home, photos, repair it, chores, homework, relax. It happened again the next day and again the day after that. This went on for 2 weeks, only stopping on the weekend. My parents had reported the smashing of the mailbox, but there was no evidence as to who the culprit even was, so nothing was done about it. I finally have enough of digging out broken posts and replacing them, and so, the revenge. I get up early on a Saturday and head to the end of the driveway. I dig a 2 feet by 2 feet wide hole 6 feet straight down and filled the hole with fresh cement, and in the center placed a 10-foot section of the old farmhouse original cast iron water pipes. Sunk 6 feet into the concrete. I filled the rest of the 10 feet cast iron pipe with concrete as well and mounted the mailbox on the top. Mind you, I looked into how far from the road the mailbox needed to be for safety reasons and attached ample amounts of reflectors. Monday morning comes and I notice the mailbox post has all sorts of scratches on it, but otherwise it's fine. I get to my final class of the day, creative writing, and am in the middle of a story outline for that week's project when a friend of Mike's comes in. We'll call him Steve. Steve sees me and freaks out. "Steve, do you have any idea what you did to Mike's car?" I didn't do anything to Mike's car. I don't even know what it looks like." "Steve, your little stunt with the mailbox totaled it. He had to get it towed into town at 5 a.m. this morning." "Small town. Auto garage is definitely closed at 5 a.m. "Steve, he's gonna sue the franc out of you." Censored for r/, just in case. Okay, but you are aware that deliberately hitting and or damaging a mailbox is a federal offense, right? "Steve, what are you talking about?" You don't actually own your mailbox. Legally it belongs to the post office, so destroying a mailbox is destroying government property, making it a federal offense." "Steve, so what? He'll get a little fine. But you're gonna pay." Oh no, ha ha ha, it's actually a $250,000 fine or up to 3 years in prison per offense for vandalizing a mailbox. And since it's happened 10 times in the last 2 weeks, that translates to either a $2.5 million fine or up to 30 years in prison. Steve just stares at me for a moment and storms out. At that point I pull up the federal statute on the computer I was working on, and Mike comes in insisting that I'm making that who thing up. So I show him the law and he freezes. You can take me to court and I might have to pay a small fine and maybe even tear down the mailbox, but your life would be over." "Mike, maybe, but you can't prove I did it 10 times. Actually I took photos of the damages so I can prove it was at least 10 times. But even if I couldn't, $250,000 is still a lot of money, much more than your car is worth, I'm sure. Would you really bankrupt yourself or even get yourself sent to prison to force me to pay you $1 grand or $2 for the car?" Mike stormed out of the classroom and never bothered me again. The best part was actually the domino effect this created. You see, Mike didn't have enough credits to graduate on time. Wasted too much time trying to be a Dr. Phil case, I guess. I heard through that small town grapevine that he was eventually shunted over to adult programs by the school. Without his car, which was total, and unable to afford another, his mother bought the first one and refused to buy a second when she found out how he totaled it. He couldn't get to his classes and was eventually tossed out of school due to attendance problems. Without a diploma or GED, he couldn't get into even a community college nor find proper work. Not having access to gainful employment left him living with his mother in a trailer, living off her and the occasional odd job he gets. Meanwhile, I'm now married with a child and living in beautiful subtropical Algarve in the south of Portugal in Europe. Mike, if you're out there reading this, I only have one real question: just how did that mailbox taste?